We got to do something. Now, after the war, that would be the big one. I mean, Vietnam was classified as a little one, right? Well, anyway. So we went about trying to control the world's population through the food. And one of the things is, if you subsidize the farmer, you make food cheaper. And what came into being on that? Well, sold to other countries, but we got feedlots out of that. How many of you think that a feedlot makes money selling cows, beef? No. They make money selling grain. Okay? When you took Herefords, Angus, British Whites, the British breeds, which were always bred to have a very high milk production, and they were all milk cows at some point or other, and that ended up, because of that, we had really good tasting beef. The problem is they finished quickly. So if you put that breed into a feedlot, guess what happened? Within 2 to 3 weeks, that cow was ready to be processed. They're not selling beef in feedlots, they're selling grain. So that's why they encourage the continental breeds to come over to be crossed with ours to breed out the grass-fed genetics. And one thing led to another, and we have poor quality beef. But how long does it take to finish a steer in the system?
6 months.
5 to 6 months, exactly right. So the more corn they sell to the investors that own the cows, the more money they make. Now, when you did that, then we ended up with poor health, among other things. One of the things, there's a really good book out called Steak. The first chapter is worth the price of the book. He talks about West Texas feedlots and other places around the far west, Kansas and what have you. First of all, there's antibiotics. 80% of all antibiotics manufactured in the United States given to animals. That's primarily pigs, chicken, and beef. 80%. 80%. Yes, sir. And so you're ingesting antibiotics. There's at least 6 to 8 hormones that are put into cows by putting implants in their ears. Sometimes people wonder maybe why young girls are developing breasts at 8 and 9 years old instead of 12 or 14. It's because of the hormones. But one of the things they do is as they feed these cows, they start putting them on corn. Well, most of it's GMO. And, well, in fact, probably all of it's GMO at this point. At any rate, they feed them corn, and they build this up they want to get to a certain level. And they know what the level is when 1 or 2 out of the pen die. Then they back off on the amount of corn they feed. But one of the things that all that grain does, which grain is very unhealthy for a cow, it's grass. I don't mean to be religious about this, but God put cows on earth to eat grass, not grain. And convert something that is worthless to us into something that's good for us. They also don't create pollution. My cows don't burp and pass gas like feedlot cows. So, at any rate. But one of the things that happens to the liver is they create abscesses in it. I refuse to eat liver out of a chicken, a cow, or a pig because I know that it creates abscess in that whole process. Because what's the liver? It's the filtration system. But all this is so intertwined and interrelated, and suddenly why do we get health problems? Which we'll go through more in a minute. Now, I have a friend up in Oklahoma that had he graduated from A&M about 1948. He and his family moved to Oklahoma, and they bought a ranch, about 2,700 acres. And, of course, he was just loaded with information. We're going to feed the world. And so they start growing, they start using all these chemicals, and they go on for years. And after you use chemicals for a while, then you got to use more chemicals, and then more chemicals. And one day he woke up, and it crossed his mind I'm going broke, and I'm going to lose this ranch. So he went back to his father, and his grandfather was still alive. He says, I don't know what you did, but you made money, and I'm losing money. I want you to show me how to do this over. And so he completely changed, and he sold the ranch about 6 or 7 years ago But he saved the ranch. It was all because he got away from chemicals and started doing it the old-fashioned way. And what was really kind of funny is he backed into organic certification by accident. He really wasn't planning on being an organic farmer. He just didn't want to go broke. And he stumbled into it, which is kind of cool. You know, you all know something about commercial fertilizers. I'm sure most of you wouldn't be here today if you didn't know something about them. There's a lot of heavy metals. Comes from industry, various kinds. Power plants, that's always one to me is an interesting one. I don't know whether you all knew this, but over around Bonham, they wanted to build a power plant, coal-fired power plant, 3 or 4 years ago. And these people were all worked up, and they formed this organization called CORE. And I'm not knocking that, don't get me wrong. But their whole thing is that they're going to have smoke coming out of this thing, and it's going to create pollution. Well, folks, you haven't looked at a power plant lately. Coal-powered power plants produce very little pollution. Very little heavy metals get out into their exhaust that they have. But they filter it through scrubbers. The question I kept saying to some of these people was, don't worry about what comes out of the stack, worry about what they're doing with the stuff. And what it is, it's a mineral. You know, everybody knows you need minerals in the soil to make crops grow. So what do they do with that stuff that they take out of the scrubbers? They sell it to fertilizer companies. Now fertilizer companies, when you pick up a bag, 50-pound bag of commercial fertilizer, it's not all fertilizer. There's industrial fillers. Sometimes those fillers are not toxic. Sometimes they are. But for many of the minerals, all you got to do is buy off enough politicians to get the EPA to declare that that byproduct that came out of the scrubbers is a mineral and it ought to be put back on the fields. Guess what, folks? You got to worry about what's in the fertilizer. And years ago, before I knew any of this, and I stumbled onto this, and it just dawned on me a couple of weeks ago. We lived in Southwest Florida, and we had a oil-powered power plant. And I had a friend, I belonged to the Lions Club, and I had a friend who drove one of these big dump trucks. And one Saturday, I noticed that he was waiting in line to go into this power plant. So I ran across him a couple of days later, and I said, what were you doing? He says, I don't know, but they paid a hell of a lot for me. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, there was something that they get out of the power plants, and they wanted us to haul it off. They paid us a premium. Guess what it was, folks? It was all that stuff out of the scrubbers. And they were hauling it off someplace. Now, you know, if you have to dispose of that through the EPA, it costs you a fortune. But if you can convince the EPA that that's something that the soil needs, guess what? You get paid for your toxin. How's that for getting away with whatever? And that's just the way it is. Another one, and I'm sure some of you will identify with this. How many of you have stopped using fluoride toothpaste? How many of you ought to stop? Well, everybody. But what do we get fluoride from? Well, fluoride is a byproduct of the commercial fertilizer industry. And so back in the 40s, there was actually 3 organizations involved with this. The first one was the government. When you process uranium for the atomic bomb, one of the byproducts was sodium fluoride. The other was the darling of the Industrial Revolution at that point in time, was the aluminum industry. Because they were building airplanes that could fight, and they were better and stronger than the ones that had fabric on them. And the third one was the people making the gunpowder, which later became the fertilizer industry. They all had sodium fluoride as a byproduct. So they go out, and they'd heard that a bunch of soldiers from around Hereford, Texas, didn't have any cavities. Well, around that Hereford area, there's some places that has a lot of natural fluoride. And the problem is, you know, they take a license to do what they want. But one of the problems is that fluoride does not prevent cavities. And if you get too much of it, it causes fluorosis. And I knew people from the Hereford area that had gray, motley teeth. That's from too much fluoride. Do you know why the other soldiers didn't have cavities? There was a tremendous amount of calcium in the soil around Hereford. It was the calcium that prevented that. And then so they went and they try to convince communities that they needed fluoride in the water. And if a doctor or a dentist objected because of the toxins, they would discredit them if they got any kind of a vocal, where people were picking up on it in the radio or whatever it happened to be. And then they would discredit them. They might bring in a prostitute and set the guy up, whatever it would take to lose his license or discredit him so he couldn't talk anymore. And that went on for years and years and years, and it grew. Now, as time goes on, you got to think about it. I mean, corporate, I don't want to use the word greed, that's not right. Corporations are devious. And when you think about how devious this really is, what did they do with fluoride? Well, let me rephrase that. How much fluoride do you consume in a city like Fort Worth or Dallas when you drink water? Versus how much water is produced with fluoride in it. The people drink this much. This much is gotten rid of. Where does it go? It goes on people's yards, it goes down the toilet, it goes down the shower, it goes in car washes, or whatever. Think about it. These people got paid to get rid of the toxic waste to totally make this country toxic. And they get paid for doing it. Isn't that swell? Now, one of the things is, earlier we're talking about some of the greed on this thing with the GMOs. Besides, I can never think of Percy's last name. What was it? Percy... Yeah. Percy was set up. They knew he saved his seeds. So Monsanto, through whatever group it took to do that, they planted canola next to his farm, knowing that the pollination would go onto his crops. He'd save the seed. The next year he'd plant it. Then they could take him to court for stealing their patents. And that's what happened. Then, down in Mexico, they planted GM stuff, and they're now saying that the pollen from this goes about 500 miles. They now say that the indigenous corn that Mexicans have been saving for hundreds of years is now GMO contaminated, because they would plant GMO corn crops in areas that they selected where they wanted, knowing where the winds were at, so it carried through and it's contaminated almost all the corn. What can I say? It says it all. Now, the on top of it is how many of you use canola oil? Good. You know why? Almost 100% genetically engineered. It's a horrible product. I don't care what it is. I don't think there's that much organic, and the problem is how you tell the difference. When there are other things. What's a better oil to use? Olive oil? No, I'll get to that one in a minute. No. Olive oil and coconut oil. And coconut oil is wonderful. In the South Pacific Islands, before we contaminated them, they had coconut, hogs, chickens, berries, fruits, taro roots, and they had no heart disease, they had no cancer, they had no obesity. We move in and we give them the SAD. That's the standard American diet. But the point is, coconut oil is fine. You say peanut oil. Yes and no. If you can keep it under 160 degrees, it's okay. But when you fry something in it, it's not 160 degrees, and it becomes a trans fatty acid just like all the others. So it depends on how you use it. Now, a lot of places, stir fry, you can keep the temperature at 160 degrees, so it can be used safely. But, how many people go to Chick-fil-A? We're wonderful. We use healthy oil. We use peanut oil. So how much oil do you think is in that store that's under 160 degrees? None of it. Now, I have a friend, and other people here feel this way. I was talking to Jeffrey last night, that Monsanto and the CEO of Monsanto is probably the single most evil entity in the world today. But not as a lawyer I say that, but as a lawyer you can't do that.